invite you to turn in your Bible to Psalm chapter 40. We'll be continuing our study that we had begun last week. And this morning we'll look at the first, or really the middle section, verses 6 through 10. So may you hear the word of the Lord this morning. In sacrifice and offering you have not delighted, but you have given me an open ear. Burnt offering and sin offering you have not required. Then I said, behold, I have come. In the scroll of the book it is written of me. I delight to do your will, O my God. Your law is within my heart. I have told the glad news of deliverance in the great congregation. Behold, I have not restrained my lips, as you know, O Lord. I have not hidden your deliverance within my heart. I have spoken of your faithfulness and your salvation. I have not concealed your steadfast love and your faithfulness from the great congregation. May God bless the reading and the application of his word upon our hearts this morning. Now, there are several types of illustrations a pastor may think to share when coming to a text. And especially there are those old and very gimmicky, cheesy, if you will, kind of illustrations, which often intend to describe the difference between a false outward Christianity and a true biblical inward Christianity. You may have heard these as it goes, that standing in a bank doesn't guarantee you're an account holder. Standing in a parking garage doesn't make you a car. Being invited over for dinner to someone's house doesn't make you part of the family. And even sitting in a stadium does not mean that you are on that team. And again, these illustrations are used all the time. And while they are, in a way, somewhat cheesy, they do convey a real point that genuine Christianity is not simply a set of outward practices and ordinances. But rather, the Bible shows us over and over again that a Christian is one whose heart is wholly devoted to doing what pleases the Lord. Again, like these illustrations that we have heard, a single act or a single appearance does not equate to continued inward devotion. Again, it's not the right act or behavioral pattern that brings the Lord's deliverance or pleasure. But again, as David had acknowledged and proclaimed earlier in Psalm 40, the Lord's wonderful deeds and thoughts towards us, he then responds with a heart of genuine worship that desires to continually do what pleases the Lord. Again, notice that he turns now, while keeping God's faithful works and thoughts in view, from verse 5, to speak on genuine obedience and worship of those who love the Lord. Again, in this psalm, David is not recalling or recommending a perfect record of compliance, and nor is he encouraging a type of outward conformity or religious practice. In fact, as we examine verse 6, it seems he's cutting to the heart of false belief. Again, he says in verse 6, in sacrifice and offering, you have not delighted, but you have given me an open ear. Burnt offering and sin offering you have not required. Now, it may seem at first that the psalmist is critical of what is called the ceremonial law, that division of the law that pertained to Israel's purification and sacrifices and offerings and ritual aspects of worship to God in the tabernacle and temple under the Old Covenant. But I think what becomes more clear as we consider the historical context of the author is that David is not critical of God's instructions. He's not critical of good and God-glorifying sacrifices and offerings. he is critical of those practices being performed when they are void of genuine, heartfelt obedience. Again, he's opposed to outward religion that does not inwardly delight and trust in the Lord. Because a heart that does not wholly depend upon the Lord does not genuinely worship him as he has regulated and required. Again, this was a familiar situation in David's own history. He had known Saul's lack of obedience and dependence on the Lord. Again, if you turn over to 1 Samuel 15, we find in that chapter that the prophet Samuel was sent by the Lord to anoint Saul as king over Israel. And through the prophet, the Lord had instructed Saul to strike down and destroy the Amalekites because they stood against the Lord's people. In fact, the Lord said they were to be entirely annihilated. Everyone, all of their animals, everything was to be annihilated because they stood opposed to God's people as they came out of Egypt through God's deliverance. And so the Lord said this explicitly. Don't just threaten them, remove them from the earth entirely. But again, down in verse 9 of 1 Samuel 15, we read that Saul and the people spared King Agag and the best of the sheep and of the oxen and of the fattened calves and the lambs and all that was good, and they would not utterly destroy them. All that was despised and worthless, that they devoted to destruction. And so David is familiar with this situation in his own history. Saul did not listen to the Lord. He did what was right in his own eyes, the outcome of which was disobedience and a desire for independence. Again, I think as we continue to look back to 1 Samuel 15, we find that the Lord spoke to the prophet Samuel, and he instructed him to go and confront Saul. And Samuel arrived to meet with him, and as he arrived, the text tells us that the prophet heard and saw the creatures kept. He witnessed the very outcome of Saul's disobedience. In fact, down in verses 20 and 21, Saul said to Samuel, I have obeyed the voice of the Lord. I have gone on the mission on which the Lord sent me. I have brought Agag, the king of Amalek, and I have devoted the Amalekites to destruction. But the people took of the spoil, sheep and oxen, the best of the things devoted to destruction, to sacrifice to the Lord your God in Gilgal. Church, do you hear the age-old issue in Saul's response? Doesn't it sound exactly the same as Adam back in the garden? It was the woman you gave. Lord, it was the people you put me over. Again, no matter if we were on Genesis 3 or in 1 Samuel 15 or forward, we find the same thing. The heart of the issue is always the issue of the heart. Because a heart that does not depend upon the Lord does not genuinely worship and obey him. Again, we find that Samuel responded to Saul in verse 22 and 23, almost saying in a similar way what David is saying in Psalm 40. Samuel responded saying, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, for rebellion is as the sin of divination, of witchcraft, and presumption is as iniquity and idolatry. And Samuel told Saul, because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. Again, church, these are the kinds of sacrifices and offerings God has no delight in, and which he has not required. It's the outward, cold, unbelieving religious practice that does not listen to the Lord. That really and ultimately seeks to self-determine and self-interpret the word of the Lord. This is why the Lord rejected Saul as king over Israel. Again, 1 Samuel, if you've read the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 15 is not a single momentary lapse of judgment for King Saul. It was the evidence of a heart that did not truly depend upon and listen to the Lord. Even earlier in just a few chapters of 1 Samuel 13, Saul had offered an unlawful sacrifice. And the prophet said to him in verse 14, "Now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart," David, "and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." Again, it was only a few chapters later that we find in 1 Samuel 16 that Samuel goes to anoint David. Again and again, Saul is told, "You are not listening to the Lord," and it is an evidence of how far your heart is from him. Samuel was told, "Go and anoint David." And as he anointed him, the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. See, again, in all of this, the psalmist knew. David knew historically and theologically and even practically in his own life that the Lord delights in the worshiper who gladly seeks to listen and obey him. Again, David knew this from his own experience. Like when he repented before the Lord from his adultery with Bathsheba and his murder of Uriah. David said in Psalm 51, verse 15 through 17, "O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth will declare your praise. For you will not delight in sacrifice, or I would give it. You will not be pleased with a burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit and a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise." Well, friends, I think we may ask in our own lives, what does it look like, practically, to wholeheartedly depend upon and worship the Lord? How can I genuinely listen and obey God, especially when I struggle daily in my own life? And I think it's here that the psalmist reminds us wonderfully that it's not more tithes. It isn't more outward practices. It's a heart posture. It's a humility of the whole person. It's a genuine desire to do what pleases the Lord. Again, this is why the New Testament cites these very verses we're expositing this morning in Hebrews chapter 10. Because the greatest example of one who shows that they are so willingly dependent upon the Lord and they turn to listen and to honor the Lord in what they do is Jesus in his humanity. Again, if you turn over to Hebrews chapter 10, the preacher picks up on this and applies these words, not to David, but to the Lord Jesus. Out of Hebrews 10 in verses 5 through 7, the preacher says, "When Christ came into the world, he said, 'Sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body have you prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sin offerings you have taken no pleasure.' Then I said, 'Behold, I have come to do your will, O God, as it is written of me in the scroll of the book.'" Now the psalm, written in Hebrew, speaks of the Lord giving an open ear. And the preacher, drawing upon the Greek translation of the Old Testament, speaks of a body prepared for him. Again, in both of these instances, this is a way of speaking of a person who is ready and willing to listen and obey God, to obey God's word. But again, this is ultimately what God does. He is the one who puts his word in our hearts and enables us to listen and obey him. And so ultimately for you and I, a heart that seeks to listen and obey the Lord in his word is entirely dependent upon the all-sufficient Savior, God's anointed one, Jesus. Because again, if our heart is not dependent upon the all-sufficient anointed one, then like Saul, our desires and our actions will actually reveal a heart that is far from God. And if our life is marked by an insincere worship and a self-dependence, it reveals that our heart is far from God. Even if on the outside it appears one way to everyone else, it still reveals that our heart is far from God. And so, dear brothers and sisters, let us not go through religious motions and practices. Let us seek like David, as we find again and again in the Psalms. Like David says at the end of Psalm 139, when he asks the Lord to examine the motivation of his heart, we ought to pray like David, saying, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." Friends, what is the motivation for you to listen and do what pleases the Lord? Maybe it's even worth asking, do we genuinely do those things? Again, there's times where, as adults, we know the value of pushing through a certain amount of fatigue, or maybe we're going through a difficult season. We can't see the end result, but we're trusting the Lord. Those are good and genuine things to rely upon the Lord. But are we genuinely coming here? When we open our Bibles, are we genuinely seeking to know the Lord or to know more about the Lord? Are we asking the Lord to examine the motivation of our heart? Again, I think these questions become important when we examine Psalm 40, because we find that a heart that seeks to listen and obey the Lord and his word is motivated by a genuine delight to do God's will. Again, as the psalmist even continues here, he speaks on the motivation of one who genuinely desires to listen and do what the Lord desires. That individual is not simply doing or saying the right things, but they are genuinely having a desire to do what the Lord desires. Again, as David writes in verse 7 and 8, "Behold, I have come. In the scroll of the book it is written of me, I delight to do your will, O my God. Your law is within my heart." Now again, this is one of the verses that is referenced in Hebrews chapter 10. But when we come to the Psalms, particularly those we know are explicitly pointing to Jesus' works and his words, I think we still ought to carefully consider the author's own context. And especially before we just jump into his intent for the Christological meaning. Because when we stop to consider David's own words here in Psalm 40, we actually find historically that Israel was instructed with great purpose before the penning of Psalm 40 that their kings were to listen and obey the Lord, and not simply as they saw fit. That the people of God needed a king, not who just appeared to rule well, but who submitted to the Lord in their listening and in their obedience to him. In fact, back in Deuteronomy chapter 17, the Lord instructed Moses concerning kings, where he said, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, approved by the Levitical priests. And it shall be with him, and he shall read in it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment, either to the right hand or to the left hand, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel. Again, the people of Israel had known, even before Saul, that what God desired was a heart that wholly depended upon him and delighted in obeying him. And again, this is the contrast we saw just a moment ago in 1 Samuel. That Saul did not see all of life and his kingship as an opportunity to depend upon the Lord. But David saw this, and he delighted in it. And so when David says here in verse 7 and 8, "Behold, I have come. In the scroll of the book it is written of me, I delight to do your will, O my God. Your law is within my heart." When he says those words, in his own context, he is showing that in his life, in his office as the king of Israel, in his practice, that he desires to do what is pleasing to the Lord. And so David knew that whether it was all the words of this law, the statutes, or the commandments, his delight was to be in the Lord and his word. Again, this is what the Lord required. It was not outward compliance to religious instructions. If that was true, Saul would not be removed as king in many ways. But it was not simply outward compliance in certain ways. It was a heart that knew, even in what appears to be difficult, even when the individual is utterly dependent, the Lord desires those who delight in doing his will. So again, this is why David is repeatedly a picture of the Christ. Why he is one who portrays a prefiguring of Jesus. Because he did not simply say, "I will do your will if I must. I will do it your way if my way doesn't work." Rather, David says as a reflection of his own heart, what is true of his heart. "I delight to do your will, oh my God. Your law is within my heart." Again and again, we hear David speak of the genuineness of obedience to the Lord, of the longing to do his will. Even as he wrote later in Psalm 119, in verse 15 and 16, he says, "I will meditate on your precepts and fix my eyes on your ways. I will delight in your statutes. I will not forget your word. I will think and focus and desire and remember all the Lord instructs me in his word." In other words, David is saying, my whole life is dependent upon and devoted to doing what is pleasing to the Lord. Again, church, that's what God desires in the lives of his people. Hearts genuinely that desire to listen and obey him. But again, we know, like us, David could never fulfill what God required of him in the scroll of the book. And he could not perfectly obey and keep all that God commands. And so it's helpful what we've seen in Hebrews 10, because ultimately David's delight in serving and obeying God is prefiguring the perfection of Christ's willing mission and sacrifice. David's hope is not in himself as an anointed king. It's in the coming anointed king who will perfectly obey, who will perfectly listen to God's instruction. And I believe this is what David knew God always desired: the perfect obedience and work of the promised Messiah, Jesus Christ. That David knew that what pleased God was not simply the most sacrifices, not simply the most offerings, the most attendance at the temple. It was a heart that knew the freedom and the delight of obeying and doing God's will, even in difficulty, even in utter dependence and fear of death. Again, think of how applicable this passage becomes to our study of Hebrews 10 just a few weeks from now. How appropriate it is for the preacher to directly cite Psalm 40 and apply it to Jesus. Again, you have a congregation that is doubting to trust in the Lord and his promises. They're in a time of terrible persecution and their need for utter dependence upon him. And they are thinking in their minds, if we just turn back, if we just go back to being Jews like everyone else around us, then we can find momentary relief. We can depend upon God in ways that aren't costly. We can do as much as we can so far as it is not culturally unacceptable among the Jews. And we can use what God provides while doing what we think is best. Again, friends, this is the issue both the psalmist and the preacher in Hebrews address. That you cannot worship or do what pleases God according to your own methods and means and mechanisms. Again, the Lord desires a people who delight in doing his will. Again, consider how we are shown this in the life and the ministry of Jesus as he is leading up to the cross. In the midst of his ministry, Jesus says in John 6, I have come down from heaven not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. And just as we read last week out of Luke 22, verse 42, Jesus prayed in the garden, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Again, Jesus willingly and perfectly shows us that he gladly took on his role in office as mediator. He is not a subordinate of the Father. He is the willing second person of the Trinity who is that all-sufficient sacrifice for sinners like you and me. That he did this in a way that shows us that what God ultimately desires and he requires is heartfelt obedience. Again, notice that the psalmist has shown us this very thing modeled in his own response in verse 7 and 8. But it's not cold. It's not a mere compliance to the Lord's deliverance. There's delight and there is joy. This is because, as Matthew Henry points out, when the moral law of God is written on our hearts, our duty will be our delight. In other words, when a believing heart seeks to obey, it's not out of outward compliance of the flesh, but in light of inward conversion of the Lord. But really, it's the Christian trusting in the promised Messiah, Jesus Christ, who can say, I delight to do your will, oh my God. Your law is within my heart. Again, the psalmist has already shown his devotion to the Lord. As we saw back in verse 4, he says, Blessed is the man who makes the Lord his trust, who does not turn to the proud, to those who go astray after a lie. Again, church, we're reminded, first in David's life and then in Jesus' life and ministry, that trusting and delighting in doing God's will does not remove our circumstances of life. It does not remove our need for dependence upon the Lord. Again, this was evident. This was known in Israel's history, in the psalmist's life, that whatever they faced or whatever they walked through, the Lord was using it in his providence. The Lord was using it, all of it. He was intending to turn them to delight in obedience and worship, where they would find their dependence upon the Lord, and they would tell of his goodness with public praise. Again, notice how we see this outcome with the psalmist, as we've continually seen in our study. As he says in verses 9 and 10, I have told the glad news of deliverance in the great congregation. Behold, I have not restrained my lips, as you know, O Lord. I have not hidden your deliverance within my heart. I have spoken of your faithfulness and your salvation. I have not concealed your steadfast love and your faithfulness from the great congregation. Now, we've observed time and time again in just these short 2 weeks that the outcome of the Lord's deliverance is a heart and a mind that naturally desires to give thanks and praise. And friends, we might ask ourselves, what trials or difficulties in our own lives has the Lord faithfully brought us through that he has given us then cause to praise him for? What might it be in the last week, in the last month, in the last year, in your own life, that the Lord has used, that you might not only give him praise, but do so publicly among the brethren? Again, throughout this psalm, David testifies in his own life that God was faithful to deliver him. And so while that may look different for certain individuals, the universal application that David shows is that his praise is public. He made known what the Lord had done. He shared among the congregation how the Lord delivered him from what otherwise seemed impossible. And I believe the psalmist does this ultimately because in public and also in private, the believer delights to wholeheartedly obey and do God's will. Again, what is in their heart is going to naturally and necessarily become present. It's going to become public in their life. This is why Jesus told the Pharisees in Matthew 12, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And so, friends, what do your words and your conversations say about your trust and your dependence upon the Lord? Again, we come in here every Sunday morning and we ask that old cultural question, how are you doing? And again, I think at times, some may overshare, some may undershare, but I think at times it can be incredibly fake, or at least masked. I think maybe sometimes our responses may be to list all the problems in our life. Nothing else could compare to the trouble that I walk through. And in that, we are so self-consumed that there is no testimony of praise. Or maybe your response is the fake it till you make it. Life sucks. I hate everything, but I'm here. God is good. Leave me alone. Love you too. Here's my theology of suffering, go away. I say the right things, but I'm not dependent upon the Lord, and my outlook is not to see his deliverance and praise him in the great congregation. Again, the Christian is not one who is instructed to find their confidence and their deliverance in themselves. In fact, the farther we go down that, the more we see our need for dependence upon the Lord. And so genuine and public praise in the assembly of God's people is the willingness to say, I have been in need and the Lord has helped me. And when I am still in need, I will tell of his faithfulness, his salvation, and his steadfast love. In church, I think this is one of the many blessings of the Lord's Day. It is to remind us to set our mind on the Lord. To remember repeatedly that we are dependent upon him. And as he brings us safely through another week, we have reason to publicly praise him together. Again, notice the joyful repetition of David's praise. David says, again, looking at verse 10, I have not hidden your deliverance within my heart. I have spoken of your faithfulness and your salvation. I have not concealed your steadfast love and your faithfulness from the great congregation. Again, the outcome of genuine deliverance is a genuine desire to give thanks and praise publicly. As one theologian noted, if our hearts are open to God's word and are being cleansed and reformed by the Lord, then our mouths will speak God's word and praise him. Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. The church, ultimately, the great news of God's deliverance for his people is that he has raised his perfect Son from that grave. That in him we have deliverance from our greatest defeat and our worst enemy. As Matthew Henry points out, Jesus' proclamation of the gospel to us has been laid clear as a priest who has worked out redemption for us, as a prophet by his own preaching in his ministry, and then through his apostles, and still through his word and his spirit to make it known to us. The church, public praise is at the heart of the Christian faith. And again, we have much to give thanks and praise for, because Jesus Christ reigns as King. And as he reigns, he is working through his people as they make known and they tell of and they rejoice in his great deliverance. That even when we walk through the difficulties of life and we struggle to see how deliverance would come, we can trust, saying, I know ultimately the Lord will deliver in his will, in his timing, because I have seen what he promised is true. That the Father raised the Son up, and he is our reigning King of whom we proclaim. Again, just as Jesus told his apostles in Acts 1, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in Judea and Samaria and to the end of the earth. The public praise of the Christian is not simply to have our heads down on the momentary struggle, but to have our heads up, looking at the end result and the good news of the gospel. That as we go forth, even in trials and in triumphs, that we would respond joyfully, with genuine hearts of praise, where by faith in Christ, we would do what is pleasing to the Lord. Because in public and in private, the believer delights to do God's will and obey with their whole heart. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we come before you, and we know in various ways we are a needy people. And Lord, none of this surprises you. You know our needs before they come from our mouths. And so, Lord, I pray, I ask, Lord, that you would comfort your people. May you convict your people. That we would not have our heads down on the troubles of momentary struggles. But Lord, just as the psalmist, that we would wait patiently for you. That you would incline to us and hear our cry. That you would lift us up. That, Lord, our minds and our hearts would not be set upon how we might feel in the moment. But, Lord, regardless of how we feel, may you point us to what is true. Lord, may you set our minds upon Christ. May you teach us what it means to truly obey your word and seek to do your will. Lord, we thank you and we praise you for all of these things. We ask them in Jesus' name. Amen.